Today I'm going to be talking about techniques of flight instruction. But before we get to techniques, we need to talk about obstacles that are going to get in the way of flight instruction. One is unfair treatment. So if students feel like they are not being treated fairly or given the same amount of attention that other students are, it's not going to be conducive to learning. They're not going to do as well. If they are seeing that an instructor is impatient, that's another thing that is going to be a big obstacle when it comes to flight instruction. So with impatience, um, it's going to be when you seek the only just the ultimate objective without considering the means necessary to get there. So you really need to put a lot of emphasis on those building blocks along the way because the entire concept that you're trying to teach at whatever given point is very important, not just the end result. Um, if they're feeling a lot of impatience from their instructor, they're going to really become disinterested in the topic and maybe even in flying in general. A worry or a lack of interest. So, students are worried or emotionally upset. You can kind of just go off the I am safe checklist with this, and anything else. Emotion is the E at the end of that I am safe acronym, and you're not going to be able to absorb very much instruction if you um, aren't in the right headspace at that given time. Discouragement and emotional upsets, these things are pretty rare when they feel like their instructor is not holding anything back from them and being very transparent. Another thing is going to be physical discomfort. They're feeling a lot of new sensations that they've never felt before, and if that's the case going on, they can't really concentrate on what's being taught, especially in the airplane. That's a very hard to learn in environment in the first place. So if somebody isn't comfortable physiologically at that point, it's going to be very hard to learn. So that's a big obstacle. And then apathy due to inadequate instruction. So to be effective, the instructor really needs to be able to level with the student and understand that students are individuals and that there's different ways to teach the different individuals. Once your instruct or once the instructor is going to be once a student loses confidence in their instructor, it's pretty much game over at that point as far as learning is concerned. Anxiety is another obstacle. So if it's clear that there's anxiety in the student, at that point, there's really not going to be any learning happening, and the instructor should just end the flight lesson at that point. Or if it just continues to happen, it's not just a one-time occurrence, then maybe as an instructor, you would need to reach out to other resources, maybe other flight instructors who could possibly better handle the situation. Um, Demonstration methods. So let's talk about demonstration performance. We're talking about techniques now. So in this method, you're going to have your explanation, your demonstration. Your student's going to perform with the instructor supervising, and then you're going to evaluate at the end. And in that explanation phase, you're just going to be talking about exactly what's going to be going on, what you expect. This is going to be prior to the flight, and just talk about these completion standards and your learning objectives that you want the student to take away from um, this lesson. And then you're going to go to the demonstration phase. Demonstration phase is going to be when the instructor is showing the student exactly how a maneuver, for example, is performed. And when you're performing this maneuver, you need to make sure that if there's any deviation in the maneuver, or if you, as an instructor, do not demonstrate it properly, that needs to immediately be acknowledged so that you're not the rule of primacy, right? So you don't want to have these students learning the wrong way at their very first experience of learning whatever it is. Um, then once you get to the student performing and the instructor supervising phase, you're really just going to have to hammer it out with practicing at this point. So in order to learn, we have to practice. We have to get in those reps. And then you're just going to, as an instructor, you're going to review and make small corrections. You do need to let the student get close to failing certain things so that they can learn from their mistakes, but don't let it go too far. It's kind of like a fine line that you just have to be able to gauge as just based off your experience as an instructor. And then when you get to the evaluation phase, you need to be verbally advising the student of their progress and how that's setting with them. You need to be offering concrete suggestions that are going to be helpful. This isn't really the time for snide remarks or telling them that they just aren't really getting it. You need to be constructive with your criticism. And then we've got the telling and doing technique. This is going to be broken down into different phases. So you're going to have the instructor is going to tell and then do. So essentially, let's say that we're performing a flight maneuver. I'm talking my way through doing a power on stall as I'm doing it. And then the student's going to tell me the steps for how to get through this power on stall. After that, then the student's going to talk themselves through it. And then finally, the student's going to do it without talking themselves through it. And as an instructor, I would evaluate at that point. Um, a positive exchange of flight controls. This falls under techniques, and it's one of the, if not the most important thing when it comes to the flight deck. There have been numerous accidents with people not knowing who's in control of the airplane because there wasn't a positive exchange. It's very, very important. It's an integral part of flight training. The procedure is a three-step process, so it's going to start out with let's say that I'm with a student. I would say, you have the flight controls. They would say, I have the flight controls. And then I would repeat again, you have the flight controls. So it's three different times that they're going to be talking about having the flight controls. So there's no confusion who has the plane at that point. And then you've got your sterile cockpit rule. So this is actually a regulation. It's 121.542. And non or flight crew members are to refrain from non-essential activities during critical phases of flight. And critical phases of flight are going to be taxi, taking off, and landing, and then it's going to be all other flight operations that are below 10,000 feet, except for cruise flight. So a lot of time is a critical phase of flight. So you really need to be paying attention in these times. It's a regulation. It's breaking the law if you're not maintaining a sterile cockpit in these situations. And it's important for an instructor to not just walk the walk, not just talk the talk, but you got to walk the walk too. So if you're flying, you need to really be living by these things that you're teaching the student. Just monkey see, monkey do type of thing. Integrated flight instruction. So integrated flight instruction refers to using outside visual references and also referring to your instruments. When this training technique is used, um, you can use visual references and then also instrument references to accomplish the same task. And this is also going to help the student later on down the road when they are trying to pick up their instrument rating, for example. Development of habit patterns. So I was talking about the law of primacy earlier. The things that you learn first are going to be what you really take to heart, and that's how you're going to think that things should be done. You need to clearly establish proper habits from the very start, and it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, so make sure they learn the right way the first time. Operating efficiency. So during integrated flight training, you're really going to emphasize the use of flight instruments and how that doesn't actually prepare them for flight into any kind of instrument meteorological conditions, excuse me. Just because you have learned how to fly by also referencing the instruments doesn't need to lead to you mistaking the fact that you think you can fly into a cloud. That's the number one killer of VFR pilots is VFR, a VFR pilot going into IFR conditions. So that's huge. You really have to emphasize that. Procedures for this, you just really need to make sure that constantly throughout training, visual references and the use of flight instruments referenced off of those visual references are being used. See and avoid is something that could really also be emphasized during flight training. At all times, students should be looking out, well, not completely at all times. I like to say it's a 90-10 rule. 90% of the time you're looking outside, and 10% of the time you're referring to your flight instruments and just searching for traffic, see and avoid skills. So, along with the see and avoid skills, 91-113 in the Federal Aviation Regulations is your right-of-way rules. And this is something that also needs to be taught to a student very early on in training so that they understand where their place is when it comes to maybe entering in a congested traffic pattern or if they're just close to other traffic in the vicinity unexpectedly. Really important. Um, Assessment of piloting ability. So, really just make sure that you're using that constructive criticism so that your student is able to work and build off of it. Because if you're critiquing somebody without it being constructive, all it is complaining, essentially. Demonstrated ability, um, that kind of goes back to not just going off of a student being able to do the entire maneuver. It's the elements of the maneuver or the elements of the task that they're learning that need to be perfected to perfect the overall maneuver. It's just that building blocks thing. With post flight evaluations, it's really recommended to have it in a written format so that a student can go back and reference that later on. A lot of times, flight instructors will just take notes while they're flying, and then they don't have to kind of redo the flight in their head and think about it again. They can just hand these notes to the student and go over that with the post flight briefing. Makes things a lot easier and it happened in real time, so you're less likely to miss things. When you're correcting student errors, you need to correct them when they happen, but also let errors develop a little bit before you're jumping on the controls or before you're telling them to fix this or fix that, because in order to learn, you need to make mistakes and understand how to correct your mistakes. So, going off of that, let's move to pilot supervision. A flight instructor is going to be the only person that, rightfully so, the only person that has a say in if a student is ready for solo, because not only is that the flight instructor certificate on the line, it's the safety of that student. If they aren't truly ready to solo and they don't need to, and that's just on the flight instructor to make that determination. Dealing with normal challenges, so things like congested traffic patterns, changing your active runways, or maybe there's an unexpected crosswind. These are things that the instructor needs to make sure the student is capable of doing before they are getting that endorsement to go solo for the first time or to just to go on any kind of solo flight. They need to be well aware of how to mitigate these risks or just to change in real time and adapt to what's changing around them. Um, visual Visualization is really just checking the students' thought processes of how they're handling a particular maneuver, for example. Um, you could sit your student down, talk to them, explain this flight circumstance. We're going to do a flight from, you know, Waco, Texas to San Antonio. Tell me about the different phases of flight, what's going to happen during this phase, during the climb, during cruise, what are we going to do when we get on with a different approach controller, just different elements of that. Let your student talk their way through it, and then you're going to go in and evaluate their thought process. And afterwards, you can make corrections of things that they missed or just kind of see what they're thinking. When you are practicing landings, the FAA recommends that you make a full stop landing each and every time. And this is really going to be important for brand new pre-private students who are just learning to fly. It's a lot going on if you're trying to reach over and throw your flaps up and hit your power again while you're still rolling, and maybe you never maintained center line. So it's just a lot of multitasking that isn't necessary at that phase of flight training. So there's no need to put your students under that pressure. Um, Another key thing that you should be doing as a flight instructor, if your student is practicing landings and they're not able to land in that first third of the runway, you need to have them doing an immediate go around every time, and they need to be the one that recognizes that. So go around save lives, and it's very important to instill that in a student from the very beginning. Um, when it comes to practical test recommendations, it's your certificate number on the line again. So you have to ensure that they know everything that they're supposed to know, and that goes back to the ACS and the PTS. Just knowing those standards, and your student should be able to meet those standards and also exceed that. On check ride day, it should be able to be your student's worst flying day, and you still have the confidence that they're going to pass that check ride. With aeronautical decision making, this is going to be your systematic approach to basically mitigating risk and how you're making decisions while you're flying. This comes down to your situational awareness. Maybe if you're solo, it's your single pilot resource management, being able to control all things and use all your resources in the cockpit and outside the cockpit. Um, with that, you've got factors that affect your decision making. So things like this are we like to call them hazardous attitudes. And the first step of being able to mitigate or give your antidote to a hazardous attitude is understanding which hazardous attitude you're displaying at that particular time. Um, the different kinds of hazardous attitudes, you got macho, anti-authority, invulnerability, impulsivity, and resignation. And there's different antidotes for all of these, and I'll get into that later in a different lesson. But these are the five key ones that the FAA has identified. Um, and there's also tests that you can take to, it's basically like a personality assessment. You fill this out, oh, you're most likely to have this hazardous attitude. And that can kind of help you identify what you're going to be looking for when you're flying. It's just self assessment at the end of the day. Being able to use your resources. So, internal resources are going to be things like your ingenuity, your knowledge, your skill, things that uh, are not tangible. Um, Systems in the aircraft also are internal resources, and your checklist, things that you can reference very easily. It's you don't need any kind of outside help. Um, don't forget also that your passengers can be a very vital resource. They can search for traffic even if they have no idea how to fly an airplane. It's easy to look out a window and tell me if there's something over there. External resources are going to be things like your air traffic controllers. These guys help tremendously, and it's their job to get you out of hairy situations. So use them. They're there to help you. And a lot of people make the mistake of not wanting to sound dumb on frequency or being scared of a controller, being upset with them. But you need to just let all that go because they are literally there to help you. So let them. One of my favorite quotes that I've got from this is from using your resources. is a superior pilot uses his superior judgment to avoid situations which are going to require his superior use of his skill. And then we're going to talk about workload management finally, and things that are going to be heavy workloads. Think of flying into a very busy environment, or if you were driving, for example, driving into a city that's got 6 lanes of traffic, that's going to be a heavy workload. Same thing for flying. If you're flying into a big city, for example, you're also going to be around a bunch of other airplanes, and you're going to be changing the direction that you're flying, maybe changing the altitude that you're flying, things like that. So heavy workloads need to be expected when you're going to be facing that, and that's going to make you able to really react to that heavy workload a lot better than if you come by it by surprise. When you're task saturated, it's very hard to concentrate. Um, if you have trained to be an instrument rated pilot, you understand this very deeply. Um, there's a lot going on. Multitasking is very hard when you've got a million things to do. It seems like there's nobody there to help you. So you just need to really be prepared for that and kind of have an idea of what you're going to be facing when you're going into that. And this is all of my techniques for flight instruction.